966.
In episode 87 of the 966, we explored the concept and themes of Salmani architecture, the unique style of design originating in Saudi Arabia that is characterized by its connection to local heritage and a firm intention of concept and form. We are pleased to pick up where we left off by welcoming on to the 966 Nadia Maqbool Al Lawatiya, a leading Riyadh-based architect and urban designer who is closely familiar with the Salmani architecture style. Nadia listened to the episode we did on Salmani architecture and was recommended to us by several listeners and ultimately introduced to us through another previous guest on the program, Todd Albert Nims. Nadia, welcome on to the 966. Nice to see you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy and excited to be here.
So can you tell us a little bit about your background? You're Omani, and I love that, as you describe yourself, you're passionate about the interplay between culture, memory, and sustainability. But you make a very specific reference that your working language is in your tribal language, which is a Lawati. And I guess the Lawati merchant is a very large, historically deep merchant family in Oman, correct?
Yes. So the Lawati family is a very unique family in Oman. From an architectural perspective, from a spatial perspective, we live in a place called the Corniche, the Matrah Corniche in Muscat. And it is the only surviving, I believe, medieval Islamic settlement. It's a very traditional settlement. It's got four corners with four towers, and it has a boundary wall, and the houses inside are very, very compact, very, very actually very aligned to the principles of Salmani architecture that we'll most probably be talking about later, about human centricity and connectivity and authenticity. And that's where I grew up. As a child, my parents would go to work and they would drop me at my grandparents' house in this place. And I remember very distinctly visiting all my grandmother's friends during the day. As a student, I studied about domestic architecture between modernity and tradition. And I really focused on what we call space syntax, which is the relationship between the spaces more than the actual physical structures. And I remember experiencing this as a child. They talk about these settlements, the traditional Islamic settlements. During the day, men would leave completely, and the entire settlement would become a female-dominated space. So, women will take off their abayas and their scarves, and it was like the whole settlement is like a big house. And then when the men would come back after work or at lunchtime, everyone would go into their little houses or their rooms, and it becomes private, and then the streets and the alleyways become public space. So the malleability between public and private always fascinated me as a child. And I think the Lawatiya Quarter or Harat Al Lawatiya in Matrah really, really taught me that.
Fascinating. So you were paying attention at a very early age at structures and space and design.
Sorry, go ahead, Richard.
No, go ahead, please.
Well, I think I'm half Omani and I'm actually half Peruvian. So this whole concept of identity and how we express that identity, whether it be through fashion, art, craftsmanship, and architecture, and moving between spaces in architecture has always fascinated me, because I've always been very aware of the differences in how people of different cultures and people of different religions, and how religion and culture influence their movement through space. And another thing that I studied was the layering of space, the privacy. So in the same way that women in Islam wear a hijab to create this defensible space around them to keep, strangers at bay, as one reason for it, Islamic architecture does the same thing. It has the same hijabs manifested in courtyards, in arcades, in entrances, and how you shift 90 degrees when you enter into a domestic realm, for example, and you have to shift 90 degrees as a mechanism for protecting the people of the house visually. So I think I was very sensitive to all of these things way before I studied architecture, or way before I even realized that I had an interest in architecture.
And where did you study architecture? You're award-winning. I mean, you've been recognized with any number of awards, but where did you study? And
I studied in the Glasgow School of Art, which is part of Glasgow University in Scotland. And it was a very, very special school because it's an art school. So the architecture school was neighbors with sculpturists, the school of sculpture, the fine arts, product design, jewelry design. And that was another fascinating thing. I mean, I think lots of students were fascinated by me because in those days I used to wear the hijab, I used to cover up. So everyone was really, really interested in this, Arab girl who looked very different and who was very, very curious. And I think all artists are very, very curious, and you ask questions without getting offended, or it's like a completely different space as an artist.
Well, I'm anxious. I know our listeners are too, to sort of get to talking about architecture in Riyadh. But before we do that, you're a founding member of 23 Degrees North, which is an architectural consulting firm. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What's the significance of 23 Degrees North?
Okay. 23 degrees north is the latitude of Muscat. It's like on the Cancer latitudinal line on the Earth. And the reason we chose that name is because we believe in architecture that celebrates everything that roots it. We believe that good design is rooted in place, in climate, in topography, in culture, in religion. So the latitude, the geographic point is kind of like a reference to all of these things. And good architecture is architecture that addresses all of these things together.
So let's talk about your sort of original thought or concept. You mentioned it, modernity and tradition. And
yes,
the piece that Lucian referenced that we did was looking at Salmani architecture, and it looked at the role King Salman played as the Emir of Riyadh for over 40 years. And it looked at, that in fact, Saudi Arabia has now established sort of a charter design and has tried to put some description and definitions of what Salmani architecture is. And we won't go through that, but it seems to me to be an effort to authentically and organically marry these elements of modernity and tradition.
Yes. I mean, the amazingly exciting thing that is happening in Saudi Arabia at the moment is these giga projects, the scale of projects. It's one of the reasons that I came here. It's the perfect playground for artists and architects. And you have these two types of projects. You have projects that are very, very modern, that seem to be quite abstract, and almost people would argue that completely do not belong to the traditional fabric of the country. And then you have this other family of architecture that is deeply rooted in a recognizable way. And what I love about the Salmani Charter is that it is not a guideline, it is not a specification, it's not a standard, it is not even a code of architecture. These are all like, technical words to describe guidance, to describe a set of rules that you want a community of architects working in a certain climate or geographical context to be considerate of. Salmani architecture is more of a philosophy. And I really like that because it guides without any form of restriction. And it acknowledges this fluid plasticine-like of traditional architecture. And this is very unique to this region because, in the Western world, traditional architecture lives in the past. It's historical. It has no place in the present. Like I studied and I lived and I worked in the United Kingdom, and there you have listed buildings. And if you're a homeowner and your building suddenly becomes a listed building, it's almost like a curse because you can't do anything with it. And anything that you do with it, it costs you so much money. It's very rigid. But in this part of the world, it's not like that at all. It's something to be proud of. And there's this understanding and acknowledgement and almost expectation that old buildings need to be allowed for designers and architects to breathe new life into it. And Salmani architecture totally allows that. And as I think we mentioned earlier, it's based on a set of core principles that are all fundamentally related to the human experience, how these buildings and the spaces between these buildings enhance the user, the visitor, the person's experience when inside these buildings or walking around these buildings.
Well, so let's talk just again for the purpose of the conversation. is it okay if I just list what are seen
Yes.
as the core principles? And that's so one is authenticity,
Yeah.
uh, two is
So
continuity, and then and I'll let you. And then three, human centricity, four, livability, five, innovation, six, sustainability.
yeah.
And so these, what you're saying is it's not a rigid requirement, or it's not a regulatory scheme where you have to. It's a suggestion, it's an encouragement, it's a guideline in essence.
Yes. So the way when Salmani architecture was presented to the world, I remember there was an exhibition attached to it, and not only did they present these core principles, but they presented exemplar projects that embody these principles, which I think is really important. And it's really important to note that these were exemplar projects, projects that embody, and these projects aren't the only way of embodying these principles. So, for example, if we go to the first principle, authenticity, it's all about having a rigorous methodology, a thoughtfulness to, you can't, or I don't think Salmani architecture will just accept any architecture being labeled Salmani architecture without having a proper narrative and a proper story that is rooted to the past and to the present and to the future. And this one key principle relates to innovation, which is, I think, the last principle. And it also relates to human centricity, which is, it's all about the thought process. So as a creative or as an architect, the way I appreciate this core principle is that it's giving me, Nadia, the ability to come up with my own methodology, my own narrative. When I'm designing a building, I could look at the site, look at the climate, the topography, look at the regional architecture of where this site sits, and then create a narrative that blends all of these together and add in the modern use of the building. You know, I could be designing a hotel, or I could be designing a cinema, which didn't exist traditionally, but this is a new use that I can weave all of these things together. And on top of that, I can also add modern material and new technology that wasn't available when a traditional architecture, in the traditional architecture. And as long as I can weave all of these things together and create a narrative, then I believe that that would be successful embodiment of Salmani architecture. Now, the one thing to note is that Salmani architecture was born in Riyadh. So it addresses Najdi architecture, which is the regional architecture of Riyadh. Now, I believe what the kingdom is trying to do now is take Salmani architecture and broaden it, take these philosophies, these ideas, these core principles, and apply them across the country. And Saudi Arabia is vast, not just in land mass, but also in its cultural diversity and its architectural diversity. I've spent 2 years here. I don't think I've seen it all, and I'm working almost everywhere. So it is so completely rich that this first core principle could birth so many methodologies, so many narratives that weave in so many different elements. And in the same way that you have different types of architects, like, you have Santiago Calatrava, who's an architect who is famous for his very creative approach to engineering. And then you have very different architects like Renzo Piana, for example, who is very earthy and works with natural material. You will get the same thing happening amongst Saudi architects and architects working in Saudi Arabia, where they would use this methodology and they would take it where their interests and their passions lie in the design of architecture. And again, I say, I love the philosophy aspect of it and not the code and the specification aspect of it, because it allows this sense of ownership and creativity and freedom for the creative and the designer and the architect.
So what is authentic? I mean, is it something you know when you see it? Or are there specific design themes? So, for example, you look at, King Abdullah Financial District or any number of other things, and I look at that. Yeah. Let's look at the, the metro station there, and it's very modernist, obviously, but for me, I see all these tiles. It's all tiles, and then
yes.
A lot of the buildings, they're sort of they're clad, and I termed it, again, I don't know what I'm talking about, but I said it reminds me of Mashrabiyah. So many of the buildings have sort of a cladding to it, a design feature that for me evokes Mashrabiyah. But but again, so I guess back to the question, how do you know what's authentic?
So, so like I said, for me, authenticity is being true in a storyline, in a narrative, where you have a very strong beginning, a strong middle, and a strong end. The beginning being the the drivers, and then the end being the product. So the way I work is that I've developed this, what I call this four-step methodology, where whenever I'm designing a building, I think of the design drivers that would have driven a certain style of regional traditional architecture. That's the first step. Usually these design drivers are climate, usually they're topography, usually they could also be cultural traditional expression, traditional natural resources available in this place. And then the second step would be to really understand the architectural language or the cultural vocabulary of that region. So for example, in Riyadh, the Najdi architecture, you have very recognizable prominent features. For example, the Najdi triangle, the patterns that you see in Kaft and you also see in the DQ. You see these castellated parapets. You see the turma, which is the little projection that comes out of the walls, where traditionally it used to be a defensive mechanism where they used to pour hot oil down. It used to be positioned right above the entrances, and then they used to pour hot oil when they're at risk of being invaded. So these are a few examples of the recognizable prominent features that exist in Najdi architecture, for example. Step 2. Step 3, then I would have this a scale of interpretation from very traditional to very, very abstract. And then I would, depending on the building program, the location, the client's own aspirations, I would agree and decide which level of interpretation on the spectrum I can work with. So Kaft is quite a modern to abstract level of interpretation of Najdi architecture. DQ is more traditional. Mm-hmm. But even in DQ, like I love Kindi Square in DQ, where you have the square, and then on the one side you have the RCRC building, and then the other side you have all of the restaurants and the coffee shops. And when you stand in the middle of the square, you're faced with a very abstract modern interpretation of Najdi in the RCRC building. And then you have the very traditional interpretation of Najdi, and they both talk to each other. They look completely different. The texture of the buildings, the materiality, the scale, very, very different. But if you go back to the basic principles, which is the triangles, the need to protect against the very harsh, direct sun, the need for shading, these things are common in both these buildings, even though they express it in very, very different ways. And the reason I call step number 2 culture vocabulary is because, especially in the Arabic language, you have a set of words and you can say something in very, very classical Arabic. So for example, in English, the manifestation would be, thou shalt not touch. But then you can also move on to the very abstract, modern way of communicating and say, don't touch that. Or, like, don't touch that, do, the song. So, you're saying the same thing, but you're using very different language, and architecture can do that. And then the last step, the fourth step, is the application of the design brief or the development brief. And for me, that formula is in itself a narrative. It's a methodology. It's my methodology, and I'm sure if you speak to any other architect, they would have their own methodology. But as long as you're able to present this methodology where it's strong in all its parts, then I would say it's authentic. Now, the outcome, the product, the piece of architecture at the end, when I'm making my presentation, I show you the big, $1 million render, the money shot. You may hate it. Not everyone's going to like it, but it's okay, because as long as the person who's paying for it likes it, and he's the person that I've been developing this design with, he likes it, then it's fine. And in architecture, and I think all arts, we always say that loving something and hating something is almost the same. You never want to get a neutral reaction. So you're never going to please everyone, especially in the realm of reinterpreting and reinventing traditional architecture, because it is quite a sensitive topic sometimes.
And your reference to the RCRC leads me to the next question. So for our listeners, the RCRC is the Royal Commission for Riyadh City, which is a major driver behind the development of Riyadh. Is it it wants to expand eventually to 10, 12 million people, maybe even more. It wants to win the bid for the World Expo 2030. So it's at the heart of a lot of what's going on. But you referred to being in Riyadh at this point, in Saudi Arabia at this point, as being in a play box or a playground. Who is commissioning this work? Is it primarily government entities, PIF, other entities, or is it private sector entities as well?
All of the above. All of the above. I think recently there has been direction from, I think, all the way up from His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, that all architecture needs to be respectful to the regional architecture of where this architecture is going to be sitting. So all new proposed architecture needs to pay some kind of homage to the regional architecture. And I would even go as far as saying that even the projects that we believe have no connection to regional traditional architecture as we know it, they do have a connection. Projects like The Line, projects like Al Murabba, the new Murabba, these projects are, for example, rooted in geometry. And geometry has always been, well, geometry and mathematics has always been a key component of expression of the divine in Islam. In Islamic art, you rarely see paintings of people, of animals. You have a little bit of landscape, but predominantly, whenever an artist wants to describe the divine creation, it's always in the medium of geometry and mathematics. And I've not studied Neom and Al Murabba carefully, but my initial impression has always been that these are paying a huge tribute to this legacy of Islamic architecture, Arabic architecture.
You made a really interesting point. I think it's important going forward that the architecture in Taif will be different from Jeddah, will be different from Eastern Province, will be different from Riyadh, and that's important. That's critical. And you may have projects and work that's been done in all those regions, but let's say if we're looking at Riyadh, and you can pick one of your own if you want. Can you tell us a specific or one or two or three project or building that you really like and why? You may like a lot of them, so I thought that might be a stumper.
No, but okay. So it's always really difficult asking an architect to describe their favorite building,
or why they like it, why it speaks to you.
Okay, well, I really like DQ, and I also really like CAFT. I work in CAFT, and one of the reasons I really like CAFT is because I feel like, CAFT has been there for a really long time. I can't remember the year exactly that it was commissioned, but it's been a construction site.
I think '08. I'm just guessing, but I think it's 2008. Yeah, under Prince Abdullah, King Abdullah.
Yes. So it's been around for a really long time, and it has aged quite nicely. I mean, the buildings and the public realm, the spaces between the buildings are really beautiful. It's lovely to have lunch there. Lovelier to have lunch there in the winter than in the summer, but it's still lovely to be there, to work there. The buildings all express different levels of interpretation of Najdi architecture. Walking through those buildings, I can see the clues of where the designers and the architects were inspired and what prominent features they played with and they interpreted and they stretched to the boundaries. I also really like the use of materiality. You mentioned cladding. Cladding is a very modern material, and it's shiny and it's appropriate for a financial district. It's appropriate for the scale of those buildings. The other really difficult thing when interpreting traditional architecture is when you're working with scale. Traditional architecture has always been maximum 2, 3, 4 stories, and modern architecture in CAFT, we're talking about high-rise buildings. So to be able to take architectural features that worked on a building that is only 3 stories high and apply them to a building that is 30 stories high is not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing for an architect to do. And then it's also not an easy thing for a pedestrian walking between these buildings to appreciate that this is actually inspired and driven by something Najdi. You know, to connect the dots is not very easy. So, yeah, does that answer your question?
Well, it does. And it's really fascinating because the diplomatic quarter and CAFT are so different. But you can see all the sort of visual, emotional touchstones that they each hit. I mean, when you're in the DQ in the diplomatic quarter, it feels like you're out. You know, it's landscaped, it's green, it's the color palette is very deserty, and it's immediately recognizable. The KAFD, and Lucian, you can talk to this. You spent a lot of time there. You know, for me, it was, as I said, it was the cladding and the tiles, the triangles. You know, and your mind, and I guess that's the beauty of it. Your mind isn't aware of what it's doing, but it's looking at things and it's recognizing patterns, and that's the geometry that you're talking about.
Yes, and that's where one of the Salmani principles is also continuity. And this is what I believe they mean by the continuity, is that you walk through and your mind starts to make connections, starts to make stories, and relates. And it doesn't just relate to things that are familiar in that context. You start thinking about, architecture that you experienced in Greece or in England or, anywhere, because fundamentally, a lot of these architectures, they have the same similar drivers, and they're both addressing similar things, but they address them in different ways. And the different ways that they address them is to do with the natural resources available in that place, so the raw material that they have, and the crafts and skillsmanship that they have available.
So, Lucian, do you have a favorite building in Riyadh?
I was trying to think about it. I think Via Riyadh is probably the coolest, most modern, iteration of it. But I'm also looking at the new Sports Boulevard that's coming online, and I don't know when that's going to happen. But
yeah, Nadia gets to critique the Via Riyadh.
Yes,
in terms of Salmani architecture, which Via Riyadh, has put itself forward as sort of a prime example of Salmani architecture
and marketed as such. Yeah, which is cool.
Yeah. I mean, I remember arriving at Via Riyadh, and I hadn't seen any photographs or videos of it. It was like a real, raw, authentic experience. I remember walking through, the Dolce & Gabbana entrance, which is quite tight, and then it opens out into this magnificent courtyard. And of course, classical music was playing. They were playing Bridgerton, and so I was like, oh, this is so beautiful. And then I put on my architecture and had to get serious. They're going to ask you about this building, and I just thought it was so thoughtful, so beautiful. That courtyard was so lovely, and this whole the layering of space that unfolds and opens up. So, you walk through the very tight entrance, and then you arrive at this courtyard. And then I remember walking around the courtyard and discovering that there was a sunken courtyard underneath that. And these are all very, very traditional ways of dealing with climate, humanizing climate. So you can imagine in the summer, everyone visiting Via Riyadh will be in that underground courtyard because it's protected, it's shaded, and it's in shadow. And then, so that left a lasting impression. Of course, the acoustics and the music and Bridgerton also left a lasting impression. And then you had the massing of the building, and it has these beautiful carved windows that, I remember walking into one of these windows and just looking around, making sure nobody can hear or see me, and then, just singing, and the acoustics, the music just goes up. So this is so beautiful. I don't think Salmani architecture, traditional architecture, was very musical, but I think that's just a lovely modern side effect to it. But that was really nice. And the deep groves were there to protect the windows. So the windows were set back, right, and the walls just gave this depth to protect the windows and ultimately filter the light coming in. So the reason that they were able to have these large windows, which were appropriate because of the function, which is retail and F&B, was the compromise that they had to have these really thick walls and these niches. So there's always this negotiation, this give and take. Yeah, sorry, you wanted to say something?
That's a good one. No, I mean, I think mine's more prosaic. Although, like I said, I really like the DQ and KFD. I've always loved the Kingfisher Library, and I think that's in part.
Oh, yeah.
It was built in '85, and every time Lucia and I go by, especially in the evening, I'm going. I just love that, especially at night when all the families are out, kids are running around. It's a green area, but the whole facade, I think, is well done. And I'm a little embarrassed, but I mean, the building that somehow spoke to me when I was there last was the Al Raji Bank building, and I don't know why. It just seemed to me, it's extremely traditional. It's just a a rectangle. It's a tall rectangle, but just the way they use the stone and the way they use the glass, and it's not straight up. I thought it was very subtle. And again, another thing that looks nice at night. But also it's not particularly, in terms of architecture in Saudi Arabia and Riyadh, some of it is really, really creative and forward thinking and out there. It's a very traditional piece.
I've not. I remember Googling a Rajhi Bank because many people have said that it was their favorite building, and an image of it doesn't come to my mind immediately. But many people share.
Yeah, it can't be great then.
No, it's just I look at so many buildings every day.
Well, it's like you were saying earlier, you want to have a strong reaction one way or the other.
Yeah, exactly. So this didn't make the thing. So
oh no. But the library is a very, very special building, and it's not just. I mean, obviously the skin is really special. It's also very special because of the story. I think within its core, it houses the original building, and then they've expanded and they built the skin around it. So that's a beautiful narrative within itself. And then of course the public realm surrounding that. The building where it's so receptive to everyone in the community, not just the intellectuals who want to use the library. So that satisfies a lot of Salmani architecture core principles.
Your use of the term narrative, I mean, I think is really on target. And is this something you've seen before or encountered where it's essentially public policy that architecture needs to have a narrative, it needs to be authentic? In other words, in the US, there's no guiding, there's no suggestion. You do what you want to do. And it's sort of always been that way. But it seems this is, as with so many things in Saudi Arabia, that it's top down, but it's also thoughtful, trying to encompass a lot of things as we determine our narrative as Saudis. I just think it's fascinating. It does seem to be in the architectural field as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I talked a little bit, I think, in the beginning about how Saudi Arabia is so exciting because it's this amazing playground where there's so much happening and so much modern building happening at a scale that has never been done before, at city scales as well. And unlike anywhere else in the world, I think the Middle East in general and Saudi Arabia in particular, because of this mass building and mass design that's happening, people like me and people like my parents, they are so intimately connected to traditional architecture and their past. And, people like my parents, that generation, are the decision makers. So I'm pitching something, I'm pitching a project, I'm pitching an idea. I'm pitching it to somebody who lived in the traditional architecture that I'm either trying to relate to. And if I'm not trying to relate to it, then I believe it's a huge lost opportunity because they're the decision maker and everyone has references, right? So the story is in the continuity. And because we've experienced such vast development within our own lifetime or the lifetime of our parents, the continuity of this narrative is very, very tangible. In other places in Europe and the US, perhaps it's less tangible because traditional architecture is so old. Buildings there, like for example in England, Victorian townhouses, they were built they're completely out of my generation, my parents' parents' generation. But here is very different. Here, traditional architecture, we know people who've lived in these buildings, and they are very intimately aware of the experience of living in a building that has no air conditioning, that is yet cool and comfortable in the summer. And these things have a nostalgic power, they have an emotional power. So not only are stories and narratives important because they evoke the emotions, but when you relate them to nostalgia, to history, to memories, then your narrative and your story becomes that much more powerful. And I guess it's a selling tool.
I just can't emphasize that enough. That's a really interesting take on the recent nature and how immediate it is in terms of the collective memory. Because when I was in Alula earlier this year, same thing, but I've experienced it all over in many places in Saudi Arabia, and where you go through an old development. I mean, we're talking mud and straw, narrow alleyways, winding, wood beams if you found wood, but very 14th century. I mean, same kind of style if you wanted to, but people were living here happily up to the 70s. I mean, this is something they were living, and then they moved on. There was housing that was built or whatever. But I mean, the recency, I think, that's a really great point you make. The recency is so much more compelling and real than in many other places.
Yeah, and the pride, the attachment to that sense of identity, which is always going to be the most authentic expression of our dwelling space that we inhabit. No matter how beautifully designed modern buildings are, they're never going to have the same nostalgic power as traditional architecture is. So the more that you can create this narrative, this connection, the stronger the traditional buildings can be. Sorry, the stronger the modern buildings can be.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Is Salmani architecture, is it being exported? Like, imitation is the highest form of flattery. So are other areas around the region copying parts of it? Is it sort of spreading out? Is it taking off at all outside of Saudi borders? Or is it a little early?
I mean, the principles. So Salmani architecture, if you look at it as a philosophy, a way of thinking, a way of taking traditional architecture and giving it a place in today's world, that's what Salmani architecture does. And to my knowledge, the Salmani Charter is the most articulate, most thoughtful way of expressing this desire and this process, or the seed of a process. But in Oman, when I was practicing in Oman, we used to do that. I still had the same methodology that I explained earlier. It's just that this methodology fits in really well with Salmani architecture. Architects that work in the continuity between present and past, they're doing it. They're doing what Salmani Charter guides and preaches. Now, the output, the exemplar projects of Salmani architecture, when the Salmani Charter was presented, those embody, and they give good examples. Because the other thing that was that I believe when the charter was launched to the public, they really didn't quite understand, what do you mean? How can a philosophy give birth to an architectural style? So you needed these exemplar projects, and these exemplar projects are in Riyadh, so therefore they embody Salmani Charter using the Najdi architecture as a starting point. Now, what's going to happen in the country, I believe, is that over the next couple of months, we're going to see the Salmani Charter being used across the country. So we're going to see Salmani, and it's probably not going to be called Salmani architecture. I don't know what it's going to be called, but it's going to be called like Ta'if architecture that is aligned with the Salmani architecture charter. And you will have architecture in Ta'if that is closely related to the architectural prominent traditional features, that is one with landscape and topography and climate and all of these things. Now, in the region, outside of the kingdom, places like the Middle East and even MENA, and maybe even South America, you have people that have this continuity. Like I remember in Peru, there this what I described is still very strong, the continuity between the past and the modern architecture. And modern architects are designing buildings like Via Riyadh and making these kind of references. And they are being received really well. In Europe and the US, I am not sure if they are going to start appreciating their traditional architecture in the same way that we appreciate our traditional architecture. It would be really lovely for the Salmani architecture, and I know that it's been presented at, I think, some international architecture events. I think the Architecture Festival, the Architecture Urban Festival, last year. So it would be really nice to see the Salmani Charter awaken a curiosity in young architects in Europe and, you know, the Western world to start exploring and be curious about their traditional architecture and bring it into the modern age in the same way that Saudi architects and architects of the region are doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially in the Southwest United States, where you have the exact same climate challenges as in Saudi Arabia, where it's warm,
Yeah.
it doesn't rain as much, and you need to be cool. It's fascinating. And Richard and I are both in the Washington, D.C. area. It's so funny because when Washington, D.C. was built from the ground up with nothing here, they just copied ancient Greece, and all the buildings are Greek marble buildings. And it's like, yeah, I mean, there's a theme for that and a reason for that, but you know, it looks like Greece if you go to Constitution Avenue. So it's fascinating stuff. So
it is. It seems, you know, of those tenets, those sort of principles of Salmani architecture, you know, that we talked about early, I feel like the one you gravitate to is continuity. And I say that because most architects are going to think about livability and innovation and human centric. And I guess that's the nature of, you know, of exporting, say, Salmani architecture, because continuity in South America would be different. But the issue is that you want it to have continuity, and you say reflected, identifiable narrative that is, you know, authentic to the society. So, I mean, I just think it's fascinating, and this has been a great conversation. It's very instructive for me, and I'm a little bit envious, Nadia, because like you say, I mean, you're right in the middle of a great experiment, and with so many opportunities to sort of imprint your vision and your eye and your style and that sort of thing.
It's been amazing. It's been such an amazing experience being in Riyadh, being in the kingdom at this time after COVID, after the pandemic. I think the pandemic and the lockdown just reframed everyone's narratives regarding urban space, spaces between buildings, and how important that is, because, you know, we were locked up in our apartments for so long, and the importance of being able to access nature within our urban spaces. So I just feel like Saudi Arabia is so well positioned to be doing this work, and it has huge potential to gift the world a lot of urban design and architectural innovation, learning from the lessons that we gained quite hardly, I mean, in a difficult way, like difficult lessons learned during the pandemic and the lockdown. And, you know, this level of development and design and architectural or urban hasn't happened in the Western world for hundreds of years, not at this scale. You know, they do what I like to call surgical urban design, where, you know, they intervene, interventions here and there in existing cities, but to design whole cities, urban districts from scratch, it's fascinating.
A recent segment, was it 2 episodes ago or last episode? It was on zero gravity urbanism. You know, what's being tried and attempted with the line.
Yes.
And just speaking to your reference to trying to rethink the whole urban experience. And that's a big swing. That's an enormous, you know, it's a whole new school of thought and you know, applied on a huge scale. So it would be fascinating if that succeeds. But, you know, again, in keeping with Salmani architecture, there's a lot of thought being put into what's being built, why it's being built.
Yeah, I mean, we all know we've all been developing cities in the same way for hundreds of years. You know, there's a nucleus, there's a center, and then you expand from that center, and that center is usually the home of a major natural resource. And we know the cost of what these cities are. And we've experienced the cost of what they are during the pandemic. So if we have to change things, if we have to radically reduce our carbon footprint and radically reduce our consumption as an urban society, we need to be open to the possibility of designing cities in a completely radical new way. And I have a lot of respect for Saudi Arabia and the decision makers behind places like Neom and Murabba, because they have the courage to experiment and to do something different. And they have the courage to fail.
The amazing and brilliant Nadia Maqbool Al Lawatiya, a leading architect based in Riyadh and urban designer. An amazing privilege to speak with you, Nadia. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. Thank you for being so curious and open to my thoughts.